Every man has two countries, his own and France. Thomas Jefferson. Such words encapsulate a nation that needs no introduction, the most visited country in the world, a nation nearly unmatched in terms of its political, scientific, and artistic output, a great power, a country that could have been the sole superpower, but the golden scepter was grasped out of his hands. Hence why this video is currently spoken in English. Now, I can only scratch the surface of France. It's a universe unto itself, a universe with glorious triumphs and shameful failures. And in order to understand both of them, we have to look into the geography of the landmass of what is now known as metropolitan France. The area composed of France, like much of Europe, was inhabited by pre-Indo-European peoples, of whom we know very little about. They formed no kingdoms, empires, or even a written language. They were eventually overrun by a group of people from the plains of what are now Ukraine and the Russian steppe. These were the pre-Indo-Europeans. One subgroup of this wider people group were known as the Celts. These Celtic peoples were not a unified group either. They didn't have any massive empire or kingdom, but rather were a collection of warring tribes, without a written language or complex civilization. One Celtic group called the Parsi, and I'm mispronouncing that, would settle along the banks of a certain river. That would be known as the Seine River, and this settlement would become a city that we all know today. You may have heard of it, it's called Paris. Complex societies didn't emerge in what is now France until the arrival of the Phoenicians, who were a maritime people group of city-states located in what is now Lebanon. They would set up shop with their main colony in Carthage in North Africa and Tunisia, but they would also set up shop in small trading colonies and trading posts in southern France. History would take a curious path later, as thousands of years in the future, France would eventually colonize Lebanon and Tunisia. The Greeks followed suit, setting up colonial settlements. However, it was not until the Romans arrived when much of the area was conquered under a unified state, namely by a Roman you may have heard of, Julius Caesar, among other generals. At this time, this region was not known as France, and it was not the pinnacle of high culture either, but rather a backwater that the Romans oftentimes looked down upon. Eventually, as the dust settled, the merger of Roman and various Celtic cultures would merge together, forming the foundation of what would eventually become the French language. The French language is not a Celtic one like Irish, but rather a Romance language derived from Latin. In many ways, the language of love started out as a vulgar bastard tongue of the rulers who were from Rome, who viewed this land as a backwater part of the empire of less value than, say, the riches of Egypt. However, the Romans, while taking over various Celtic groups with relative ease, failed to take over another group, the Germanic peoples, along with the arrival of the Huns from Central Asia, who pushed those Germanic tribes/barbarians into Roman lands. The most important of these were the Franks. Now you know where the word France comes from. These Germanic invasions led to the collapse of the Western Roman Empire. While some barbarians were mostly interested in looting, many, namely the Franks, liked the perks of Roman civilization, adopting Christianity and civic institutions. The most famous of the Franks was Charlemagne, who was the most powerful man in Western Europe since the fall of the Caesars, ruling the Carolingian Empire. When he died, his empire was split into three main parts amongst his sons. One took East Francia, which was composed of what is primarily Germany today, and had more Germanic influence. The other was French Francia, which would later become the Kingdom of France, with a more Latin influence. And then there was the Middle Kingdom. Some have argued that this Middle Kingdom would be the battleground of centuries between the French and German peoples. Another proto-nation that was deeply interwoven into the history of France was, of course, England. And the area of England was once inhabited by Celtic peoples as well, who were in turn conquered by the Romans. And when the Romans left, it was taken over by various Germanic peoples, namely the Angles and Saxons. However, they eventually were taken over in turn by the Vikings, or the Norsemen, who were also Germanic and settled in northern France as well. This is why northern France is called Normandy. They would eventually adopt Christianity and the French language, and invade England under William the Conqueror. The palaces of England once had French spoken in them as the predominant language. Due to William the Conqueror, many English kings held lands in France, which confusingly made certain parts of France vassals of England. This led to a rivalry which pushed France to ally with Scotland to contain English power. Now, I'm glossing over a tremendous amount of details that would make the politics of Game of Thrones and A Song of Ice and Fire sound simple as a Dr. Seuss plot. Nonetheless, there was a 100 Years' War that broke out between the kingdoms of England and France. This is not actually 100 years long, but rather a series of wars spread across several decades that are incredibly complex, that are roughly around a century. It contains countless tales of knights, the calcification of proto-national identities, the legends of Joan of Arc and others, and most of all, the foundation of France itself, liberating the mainland from England's control. The idea of a nation-state emerged, slowly but surely, of a people unified by a national identity, united and tied to the land, with a language, culture, history, a set of ideas, and perhaps a common bloodline. Now, to be clear, this is a very complex system that came about over a long period of time. Keep in mind that many of the languages spoken in the south of France were not actual French. They spoke South Occitanian among others, and the region of Brittany still speaks a Celtic language. Nonetheless, the concept of a united French people emerged out of this slow process. However, it did not directly result in a democracy. Unlike England, where there were parliamentary barriers to the king's power, the French developed an absolute monarchy in which the king had complete control, not only over the people, but also over the nobility. Nonetheless, there were cracks in the system, particularly for the Catholic Church with the rise of the Protestant Reformation. One of the most notable figures was the Swiss John Calvin, who broke off from the Catholic Church. The Huguenots, who were French Protestants in the Catholic majority country of France, mostly found themselves in the southern and western parts of the empire, and they were forced to convert to Catholicism or go in exile or be killed. The Protestants were disproportionately well educated, and this led to a degree of brain drain, as France's best and brightest left the kingdom. After the French Wars of Religion, the French Catholics retained their dominance, which resulted in the Catholic House of Bourbon running the show for a while. This is part of the reason why New Orleans' main street is known as Bourbon Street, and it's in the French Quarter. During the 1600s, you saw the success of Spain and Portugal's empires, and France would embark on its own colonial projects in the Americas, most notably in Quebec and Haiti. Quebec and much of what is now Canada would be lost to Britain during the 7 Years' War, the first true world war, and Britain would defeat the French in India and Australia, leading the way to France becoming a second-rate maritime power. The absolute power of French kings came to its peak under Louis the Sun King. However, the excess top-down authority, along with the success of the American Revolution, of which the French helped in order to get it at the British, would result in the French Revolution. Now, the French Revolution is incredibly complex and probably would require 10 videos to do it justice in full detail, but what you need to know is that it had a profound impact on the way humans see themselves and their societies. It set the final nail in the coffin for the concept that the king is ordained by God to rule, and that the church and state should be linked as one. Instead of following the king blindly, people should identify with their people, identifying perhaps by blood, soil, ideas, the rule of law. This did not lead to a wonderland in the short run, but rather a bloodbath. One figure, Robespierre, of whom I'm mispronouncing, was in many ways the world's first dictator, an authoritarian ruler who had killed thousands, but did so not under the will of the cross or the crown, but rather what he saw as the people. This was despite calling it the First Republic, foreshadowing several French republics. In spite of the bloodbath, ideas of liberty, equality, and fraternity came to fruition, and while it didn't directly result in a democracy, but rather another authoritarian ruler, it still would set in place the foundations of liberalism. This led to one humble artilleryman from the island of Corsica by the name of Napoleon that you might have heard of coming on to the scene. French had some astounding victories up until their botched invasion of Russia. And while he was an autocrat by the standards of his time, he did set up many of the foundations of nationalism, liberalism, and meritocracy, as well as the metric system. This doesn't mean that he was for freedom for all peoples. He reinstated slavery, declared himself to be an emperor, and attempted to crush a slave uprising in Haiti, which failed, but it did lead to Napoleon selling the third of what is now the United States to Thomas Jefferson's government. So I guess Americans have him to thank for that. After Napoleon's final defeat, France went through some kings and a short stint with a second republic that lasted for a grand total of 4 years, until another empire came about under Napoleon's grandson, Napoleon III, who, unlike Napoleon I, was quite an impotent moron. And it was during this time that France took over more colonies in North Africa, in countries that are now Morocco, Algeria, and Tunisia, along with French Indochina composed of modern-day Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. The French even tried to take over Mexico under a debt disagreement but failed. This was a major turning point in Mexican nationalism. The biggest fail of all, however, would be the Franco-Prussian War, which led to a resounding Prussian victory, and the eventual creation of the German state. After this humiliation, France mended its mostly frosty relationship with Britain and even Russia in response to the growing threat of the German Empire, alongside German allies such as the Austro-Hungarian Empire and the Ottoman Turks. This would eventually result in World War I, and after a long stalemate and a tremendous amount of bloodshed, some American troops would arrive after some shady conditions and push towards an Allied victory. France won and got reparations from a furious Germany under the Versailles Treaty, which unfairly blamed the Germans predominantly for the First World War while ignoring some other elements that were by and large the product of France. The collapse of the Ottoman Turkish Empire would also allow the French to take up colonies in Syria and Lebanon, as well as cut up the Middle East in a way that wasn't very conducive to the ethnic and religious groups that existed in the region. Another factor was that the Great Depression, starting in the United States, hit France and Germany very hard, and this further humiliated the Germans, and their government ended up with hyperinflation. Given these troubling times, you saw the rise of a group called the Yahtzees. I'm going to call them that because the YouTube algorithm won't let me say the real word. After Germany had taken over a great swath of land in Austria, in Czechoslovakia, etc., they eventually invaded Poland. And as a result, France and Britain, after a long period of appeasement, declared war on Germany. The French were poorly prepared. Much of their young male population was decimated during the First World War, and their elites were oftentimes fascist sympathizers with deep anti-Semitic biases. The Germans took over what is France in a humiliating defeat, and the north was occupied by the Germans, while the fascist sympathizers controlled Vichy France to the south along with the colonies. However, a free French movement emerged, set up shop in London, and helped the Allies take over France back during the invasion of Normandy. American, British, and Canadian troops arrived on the beaches and liberated France from the Yahtzees, liberating Paris, owing back 170 years of debt for the French help during the American War of Independence. This set up the Fourth Republic, which would fight a bloody war of independence in what is now Vietnam and most notably Algeria. More accurately, a bloody war against independence, I should say. In sharp contrast to the more peaceful decolonization that we saw in Britain, the French Empire would collapse in a far more bloody fashion with a lot more resentment by its former colonies. The Fourth Republic would eventually collapse as well due to the crumbling empire and mass student protests. This would lead the center-right Free French figure Charles de Gaulle to set up the Fifth Republic. He had dismantled what remained of most of the colonial empire, but he was still a fervent nationalist. Despite the efforts of British, American, and Canadian soldiers in liberating France, he disliked the Anglosphere and wanted France to be a superpower on its own, saying that France doesn't have allies. He also developed nuclear weapons and had a quasi-independent foreign policy. He took France out of the US-led NATO alliance command, blocked Britain's integration into the European Economic Community, and called for Quebec's independence from Canada. In spite of his anti-Anglophone sentiments, the Anglosphere had to deal with him anyway since he was both anti-fascist and anti-communist. He and his successors also set up the foundations of the European Union. Now, de Gaulle wanted to make it clear that this would not lead to a federalization of France and Germany, but rather a merging of the coal and steel industries with Germany, a wartime rival. The idea was that by merging key strategic resources like coal and steel, they would not be able to go to war, since those two fundamental industries for the military were interconnected. This led to stronger trade relations with American security assurances to a degree. France and Germany became very close partners, especially with the lingering threat of the Soviet Union. And when I say Germany, I'm talking about West Germany. When the Berlin Wall fell, and West and East Germany became one Germany, France would strengthen ties with the formation of the European Union during the early 90s. It would maintain close relations with the US but at a comfortable distance, supporting the US invasion of Afghanistan under NATO Article 5, but condemning the Iraq War. It later joined the NATO command under the 2000s with some reservations regarding Anglo dominance, but has been a steadfast supporter of Ukraine against Russia. On top of that, France has seen some significant changes domestically. It has become highly secularized, becoming one of the most irreligious nations on the planet, while at the same time bringing in several Muslim migrants, mainly from North Africa, in the sphere of his former empire. This has led to quite a lot of tensions as well as violence. Its welfare state is strong, but has also seen the rise of right-wing populism, and there's been quite a lot of rioting and civil unrest. There is also ongoing resentment towards the English-speaking world for coming out on top of France in terms of power projections, which can be most notably seen in Canada. However, France is still a very close ally of the Anglosphere in spite of these disagreements, especially when it comes to confronting authoritarian regimes like Russia. France also has maintained close ties to some of its former colonies, but with quite a lot of baggage. There are a lot of military endeavors in countries like Mali, in the Sahel region in Africa, and this by and large has created a lot of controversy, and on top of that, France still controls much of the monetary policy of West Africa. Africa will become a far more important part of the French story, as they have very high birth rates, and it's likely that some of the largest portions of French speakers will be on this continent with newfound dialects. Looking back at all of this, France could have been the world's sole superpower, like Britain was during the 1800s or the US is today. But nonetheless, it has a monumental impact, despite not getting the gold trophy. It's a story woven in the lives of all of us, from our language, yes, English is heavily derived from French, our institutions, our concepts of freedom and nationhood, and even freedom fries or French fries or whatever fries the French or Belgians produced. You know, I'm not going to end this off with some profound statement, I'm just going to end this video off with some fries. And glory to France.